You might walk along the quays and find amphorae shattered where they fell. Their contents, wine, grain, oil, long since soaked into the stone or evaporated into the sea air. The fishing boats that should be returning now, their holds full of the day's catch, never arrive. The light is fading so quickly, the way it does on the edge of water, and as darkness creeps across the harbor, you begin to understand that no one has lived here for months, perhaps for years. The gulls that once fought over scraps have moved on to other shores, other settlements, where life still carries on. This is what we are about to enter together, a story written in silence, in ruins, in the desperate, half-illegible letters of kings who could not understand what was happening to their world. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean civilizations that had built a glittering web of trade and diplomacy, that had assumed their prosperity and power were permanent features of the world, began to unravel. Ships appeared from the sea, cities fell, empires that had lasted for centuries simply ceased to exist. And for more than 3,000 years, historians have been asking the same fundamental question. Who were these invaders? Where did they come from? What happened to them when they arrived? Their enemies called them the Sea Peoples, but even that name, that single, enigmatic phrase, is not what these raiders called themselves. It is a label carved by frightened scribes into stone walls, a ghost word born from desperation and confusion, and it is precisely because they are so difficult to identify, so resistant to clean historical classification, that their story has haunted scholars and captivated imaginations ever since. If you're drawn to the mysteries of the ancient world, the unknowable parts of history where certainty dissolves and competing truths shimmer like heat haze, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're diving deep into the entire story of the Sea Peoples, their shadowy first appearances in Egyptian records, the kingdoms they destroyed, the theories that attempt to explain them, and the way their arrival fundamentally reshaped human civilization. Stories like this don't need your full attention, only your willingness to let the details drift like embers on the night air. And so we return to that darkening harbor. The sun has nearly disappeared now. The last light catches the surface of the water, making it look almost mercurial, alive in a way the silent stone does not. Above the breakwater, a lone figure might have stood once, watching the horizon, watching, waiting, not knowing that everything was about to change, not understanding that the peaceful world of trade and treaties and dynastic stability was collapsing not gradually, but in a cascade of sudden catastrophes, spread across only a few generations but lasting long enough to erase entire civilizations from the earth. This is where our inquiry begins, not with certainties, but with the sensory experience of loss, with the feeling of standing in a place that has been abandoned, with the weight of not knowing. For the ancient peoples of the Mediterranean, the arrival of the Sea Peoples was not a named historical event that scholars could later examine with detachment. It was terror, it was hunger, it was the shock of discovering that the world was not stable, that the powerful could fall, that the future was not written in stone after all. And as we move deeper into this mystery, as we examine the inscriptions and pottery shards and the desperate letters sent between besieged kings, we will find that our modern attempts to solve the puzzle of who they were says something profound about how we construct history itself. The Sea Peoples resist easy categorization. They refuse to fit neatly into our preferred narratives of cause and effect. In their very inscrutability, they become a mirror held up to our own need to understand, to name, to control the chaotic movements of human populations across time and space. The harbor grows darker still. A night breeze moves across the water now, carrying with it the salt and the memory of abandonment. Somewhere out there, beyond the visible horizon, the ships came from. Somewhere across the dark water, in lands we cannot yet clearly identify, peoples whose names we do not know set sail toward fates that would be preserved only in fragments, only in the testimony of those who feared them, only in the ruins they left behind. And we are about to meet them, not as they saw themselves, but as history has allowed them to appear to us. The term itself, the Sea Peoples, is a curiosity born from the careful work of scribes nearly 3,000 years ago. It appears first not in the grandiose temple inscriptions meant to celebrate pharaonic victory, but rather in a particular document from Egypt's New Kingdom, a text that has survived through the particular mercy of dry desert air and stone preservation. In the records of Ramesses III, carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu, there exists a phrase that would echo across millennia of scholarly debate. Those whom the Egyptians called, or more precisely, those they listed without quite naming, the people from the sea, that is what they called them. Not the Libyans, whom they had known, not the Nubians, whose lands lay directly south, but groups whose origins lay elsewhere entirely, arriving by water, their provenance uncertain, even to those who faced them. And here we encounter something that makes the mystery particularly profound. The Egyptians, who documented nearly everything, who recorded the names of kings and gods, the quantities of grain in storehouses, the precise measurements of temple building projects, seemed almost deliberately vague when it came to identifying where these sea-born peoples had originated. They gave them epithets. They carved their image into temple walls. They recorded their interactions with Egyptian forces with meticulous detail. Yet a fundamental question remained unanswered in their own time, and it has remained contested ever since. Who were they really? Where did they truly come from? This is the kind of question that draws us backward through time, isn't it? Not because we expect a simple answer waiting patiently in some dusty archive, but because the mystery itself seems to grow more intricate the closer we examine it. The Sea Peoples represent something that feels almost like a crack in the historical record, a moment when the careful, interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age seems to splinter, and what emerges from that fracturing is difficult to reconstruct, much less to name with any certainty. The inscription itself speaks of conflict, of course. It speaks of invasions and military encounters. But beneath those descriptions lies a more interesting story, one that has occupied archaeologists and historians and philologists for more than a century. These 7 or 8 words, the people of the sea, the ones from foreign lands, the raiders arriving by the waters, became the anchor for an entire field of inquiry. What began as a simple Egyptian descriptive label transformed into a category that would encompass military movements, settlement patterns, destroyed cities, abandoned palaces, and the mysterious emergence of new peoples in the ancient Mediterranean world. If you find yourself drawn to these ancient puzzles, to the way a few carved phrases can open up centuries of hidden history, to the archaeology of civilizations that left us fragments but no clear answers, then perhaps you would appreciate following this investigation more deeply. This channel explores the mysteries that dwell in the margins of recorded history, the moments when empires faltered and ordinary people had to contend with forces they barely understood. If that appeals to you, subscribing would allow you to journey through many such mysteries, each one unfolding with the same careful attention to both evidence and the deep, honest uncertainty that archaeology actually demands. But return now to the broader context in which this mystery was born. To understand what made the Sea Peoples so puzzling to their contemporaries, we must first understand the world they invaded or integrated themselves into. A world that, by 1200 BCE, was already old, already sophisticated, already densely woven with trade networks and diplomatic relationships, and carefully balanced power structures. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a wilderness. It was not a frontier waiting to be discovered. It was one of the most developed, most interconnected civilizations the world had yet seen, and its collapse, or its transformation, depending on how one interprets the evidence, would echo through the subsequent centuries. The great powers of this era understood each other. They corresponded. They negotiated with one another. They arranged marriages and treaties and commercial agreements. Egypt sat at one pole of power, the Hittite Empire at another. The various Mycenaean kingdoms across the Aegean occupied a third position of influence, and the coastal cities of the Levant, places like Tyre and Sidon and Ugarit, thrived as nodes in a vast network of exchange. This was a world where you could be a merchant in Tyre, and have reasonable expectation of trading with Cyprus, or Egypt, or the Aegean coast. A world where a commodity, tin perhaps, or cedar, or dyes and fine linen, could pass through dozens of hands across thousands of miles and ultimately reach a royal palace or a temple treasury. And then, in this world of interconnection and prosperity, things began to unravel, not all at once, not everywhere simultaneously, but persistently, relentlessly. A series of catastrophes began to accumulate. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade networks that had functioned for centuries suddenly fractured. And among the causes, among the explanations that appeared in the diplomatic correspondence and the military records of the era, a new element emerged: unnamed foreign fighters, arriving by sea, attacking settlements, resisting attempts at containment, and ultimately contributing to a transformation so complete that the ancient world, the Bronze Age Mediterranean, would never again reassemble itself in quite the same form. This is where the Sea Peoples enter the record not as a singular invading force, but as a persistent, multifaceted phenomenon whose interpretation has shifted with each generation of scholarship. To understand them, then, is to understand something far larger, the mechanism by which a civilization can unravel, and how those involved in its unraveling might be remembered, or forgotten, in the accounts left behind. Picture, if you will, the world as it existed in the decades before the catastrophe, not a world of darkness or isolation, but one animated by an extraordinary network of connection. Around the year 1200 before Christ, the Mediterranean basin thrummed with exchange. Ships moved constantly across the wine-dark waters, guided by stars that had never changed, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge and wealth of civilizations that had learned to trust one another, or at least to profit from one another's existence. Egypt in this period was a nation of almost overwhelming power. The pharaohs who ruled from Memphis and Thebes commanded resources that seemed almost mythic in their abundance. The Nile, as it had for countless generations, flooded with reliable generosity, delivering silt and fertility to the Black Land, as the Egyptians called it. The temples gleamed with gold. Armies marched with discipline. The bureaucracy that managed grain, taxes, and labor stretched across an entire civilization, with the complexity of an organism perfectly adapted to its environment. And yet Egypt, for all its splendor, was no longer isolated behind its deserts and its river. It looked outward, it traded outward, it fought outward. To the north and east, across the Aegean Sea, lay the world of the Mycenaeans, palace-centered societies spread across mainland Greece and the islands. These were not the philosophers and democratic dreamers of classical Athens. They were warrior kings, their wealth accumulated through military prowess and the control of trade routes. At places like Mycenae and Tiryns, massive stone walls still speak to the engineering ambition and martial investment of these Bronze Age rulers. Their pottery, their distinctive decorated vessels, traveled far. Their ships, perhaps less efficient than those of the Egyptians but no less ambitious, ventured regularly into the waters between Europe and Asia Minor. Between these powers lay the Hittites, whose empire centered on the high plateau of Anatolia. The Hittites were perhaps the most sophisticated military power of the age, developing ironworking technologies before any rival civilization, crafting elaborate legal codes, and maintaining a bureaucratic apparatus that rivaled Egypt's in its complexity. Their capital, Hattusa, was a city of ceremonial grandeur and strategic brilliance, built and rebuilt over centuries until it became almost a living archive of its own power. The Hittites negotiated with equals. They were among the first to formalize treaties with other great powers, understanding that in a world of interconnection, written agreements had value. And then there were the lesser powers, though lesser only in the scope of their dominion. The city-states of the Levantine coast, places like Ugarit, Sidon, Tyre, and a dozen others, were not empires in the sense that Egypt or the Hittites were empires, but they were immensely wealthy. Ugarit, in particular, was a cosmopolitan entrepot where Egyptian, Hittite, and Mycenaean merchants met. Its harbor opened like welcoming arms to the Mediterranean. Its scribes wrote in multiple languages: Akkadian, Egyptian, Hittite, local Semitic dialects, scratching them out in cuneiform on clay tablets that recorded commerce, diplomacy, and the ordinary business of governance. What bound this world together was not political unity, but something more subtle, an understanding that trade enriched everyone. Tin from distant sources, perhaps from the steppes of Central Asia, perhaps from further afield, moved westward and southward toward the Mediterranean, feeding the bronze-working industries of Egypt, the Aegean, and Anatolia. Cedar of Lebanon was prized for its straightness and its fragrance. It moved northward and southward, valued for temples and shipbuilding. Lapis lazuli, that stone of the deep blue that seemed to contain the night sky, came from distant Afghanistan, was worked in the Indus Valley, passed through countless intermediaries, and ended up adorning the necks of pharaohs. Olive oil flowed, wine traveled in amphorae, papyrus, grain, fine linens. These goods and countless others moved in a great circular dance across the sea. The scale of this interconnection was profound, perhaps in some ways unprecedented. A merchant in Ugarit might own goods that had touched the hands of traders from 5 different civilizations. A Mycenaean prince might wear Hittite metalwork. An Egyptian official might read letters written in the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia by scribes writing in multiple languages. It was a world, in other words, that depended on the continuation of this order. Not everyone participated equally, certainly. The wealth concentrated in the hands of kings, temple officials, and merchant elites. But the very structure of civilization had come to rest upon the assumption that the sea would remain navigable, that trade would continue, that neighbors, however distant, could be trusted at least as far as profit extended. Consider the nature of Bronze Age diplomacy as we understand it from the surviving tablets and inscriptions. Royal powers exchanged letters with remarkable regularity. The correspondence that survives from Egypt, the Hittite archives, and the records of lesser kingdoms shows us rulers addressing one another as brother, a term that in diplomatic language signified formal equality and respect. They exchanged gifts, precious objects intended to cement alliances and affirm relationships. When disputes arose, they were typically settled through negotiation or marriage alliances, not through catastrophic war. Even conflict, when it occurred, seemed to operate within understood parameters. You could predict the seasons of military campaign. You could expect certain powers to ally with certain others. This was not, of course, a world without violence or anxiety. Military forces existed everywhere. Fortifications ringed cities. The great powers maintained armies that could number in the tens of thousands. The Hittites were locked in occasional conflict with Egypt over control of the Levantine territories. Piracy operated in the waters of the Mediterranean, a persistent low-level threat that merchants accounted for in their business calculations but did not, in this era, threaten the fundamental structure of commerce. There were always tensions, always the possibility of eruption, yet something held it all together, whether we call it custom or enlightened self-interest, or simply the inertia of a system that had evolved over centuries. The archaeological record speaks to the material comfort of this age. Palaces excavated at sites like Knossos, at Mycenae, at Hattusa, at Ugarit, show us the sophisticated interior lives of the elite. Frescoes decorated walls with images of ceremony, of nature, of the gods. Workshops produced fine pottery, metalwork of extraordinary beauty, and carved ivory inlays for furniture. Scribal schools trained young men in the arts of writing and record-keeping. Libraries accumulated clay tablets that preserved everything from religious texts to shopping lists. This was not merely a wealthy civilization or two. It was a whole network of wealthy, interconnected civilizations, each feeding the prosperity of others. And yet, prosperity and interconnection can sometimes be fragile things. When a system becomes sufficiently elaborate, when the strands binding it together become sufficiently complex, what happens when one or more of those strands breaks? What becomes clear when we read the words carved into clay tablets from the early years of the 13th century before Christ is that this world, this gleaming interconnected Bronze Age, was not actually as stable as the archaeologists first assumed when they pieced together its fragments. There was anxiety in the letters, real, palpable worry seeping through the formal language of diplomats and kings. If you were to hold one of these tablets in your hands, these pressed rectangles of Mesopotamian clay hardened in the sun, you would feel the weight of concern in every carefully cuneiform pressed line. The scribes, those meticulous recorders of royal business, left us not just records of trade and treaties, but hints of unease, whispers of concern about the stability of systems that had held for centuries. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma II, in what may be among his final official communications, describes unusual naval activity in language that carries something almost apologetic. His words, when we read them now, suggest a man trying to maintain the diplomatic pretense of normalcy, even as something was shifting beneath the surface. The phrase that appears, translated carefully by modern scholars, speaks of people coming from across the waters, moving in ways that were neither fully explained nor entirely welcomed. One does not typically find such language in the proud proclamations of imperial correspondence, yet here it was, nestled among reports of grain shipments and vassal relations. This note of something unexpected, something that required explanation or at least acknowledgement. From Egypt, from the bureaucratic heart of the pharaonic state, came similar echoes. The correspondence that filtered through the archives, these fragments that have survived the millennia, contains an almost unusual tone of repetition. The same concerns appear again and again in letters passing between officials, between governors of provinces, and the central administration. Supplies were being requested more urgently. Harbor defenses were being mentioned where they had not been mentioned before. There is a quality to these repeated references, a weight of frequency that suggests anxiety was beginning to accumulate, like clouds gathering on a horizon that was still, to the casual observer, clear. The kingdom of Canaan, that crucial land bridge between Africa and Asia, between the great powers of Egypt and the Hittites, was likewise leaving traces of this growing tension in its written record. Ugarit, perhaps the busiest, most cosmopolitan city of the eastern Mediterranean, a place where you would have heard a dozen languages in its markets on any given morning, was sending increasingly urgent appeals for military assistance. The letters from Ugarit that have come down to us have about them a quality of strained patience, of people trying to maintain their usual tone while asking for things that suggested they felt threatened. Ships, they requested. Grain. Military support. The requests came more frequently as the years passed. One message from the king of Ugarit to his ally in Cyprus carries a tone of almost desperate frustration. Where are the promised ships? Where is the aid? What is peculiar about this anxiety is that it appears in the record before any clear, documented military catastrophe occurs. Before the cities fall, before the armies march, there are these quiet disturbances in the formal language of statecraft. Modern scholars, reading these tablets now, must ask themselves, what did these administrators know? What news was reaching them that prompted such repetitive concern, such careful emphasis on defenses and supplies? Were they receiving reports from merchants traveling the sea routes? Were there whispers of ships moving under cover of darkness? Did they hear of skirmishes at the edges of their territories? The economic networks that had been built so carefully over centuries, the long chains of supply and demand that connected Egypt's grain to Hittite tin, that brought Cypriot copper and cedar from Lebanon to waiting buyers across the Mediterranean. These systems seem to show signs of strain in their correspondence. A merchant complains of delays. A governor notes that a shipment has not arrived. A king inquires after vessels that were expected at a certain port. These are small, almost mundane notations when read individually. Yet when you compile them, when you gather all the mentions of delay and disruption from the tablets that survive from the late 13th century, a pattern emerges. Something was already interfering with the smooth flow of commerce that had been the lifeblood of this interconnected world. There is also, in some of the later letters, a quality of what scholars have described as administrative confusion. Instructions seem to contradict one another. Orders are issued and then amended. There are mentions of officials being replaced, of new governors being appointed to key positions. One detects, in this fragmentary record, the sense of a bureaucratic apparatus beginning to strain under pressures that were not entirely explained in the official communications themselves. The machinery of empire continued to function, but there was a quality of friction to it now, a sense that normal procedures were being tested. In the Hittite archives, there are references to mercenary groups, to soldiers hired from outside the empire to shore up defenses. This in itself was not unusual. Mercenaries had been employed in the Mediterranean world for generations. Yet the frequency of such hirings, the emphasis placed on securing additional fighting men, suggests that someone, somewhere in the Hittite administration, believed that the forces they possessed were not adequate for whatever challenges they anticipated. It is worth pausing here to consider what a ruler must believe to decide that his own armies are insufficient, what reports must be reaching him, what intelligence, what warnings. The tone of these tablets, in sum, suggests a world that was feeling itself shift. It was not yet obvious to everyone, not yet a crisis that had transformed into open warfare and the collapse of cities, but there were those who could read the currents, who understood the language of commerce and military logistics well enough to sense that the established order was being tested. The anxiety in their written words, preserved now in museums and university archives across the world, speaks to us from across 3,000 years with remarkable clarity. Something was wrong, something was changing, and it would only accelerate. And so we arrive at the moment when the first shadows began to lengthen across the administrative records of these great powers. Not as a sudden invasion, mind you, but as something far stranger, a slow, creeping unease that carved itself into clay tablets and temple walls in the form of fragmentary reports, whispered names, and questions that the scribes themselves seemed unable to answer with certainty. The Egyptians were the first to leave us these peculiar witnesses. Around the year 1208, before the Common Era, during the reign of Merneptah, the pharaoh's scribes began noting the arrival of hostile forces moving through the waters and along the coastlines of the Mediterranean. But here is what made it so deeply strange. These raiders had no unified name, no clear national origin that the Egyptians could confidently record. They were simply there, appearing, vanishing, appearing again. The phrases that survive in hieroglyphic inscriptions refer to them with a kind of measured unease. Foreign sailors, invading warriors, those who came from the sea. But the language carries a peculiar hesitation, as though the scribes were describing something they did not fully comprehend. One of the earliest surviving accounts speaks of activity along the coasts of Canaan and the Levantine shore, where merchant cities and fortified ports suddenly found themselves under threat from naval assault. The rhythm of centuries-old trade networks began to stutter. Ships arrived not bearing goods and oil and purple dye, but bearing warriors with unfamiliar weapons and armor. And the question that haunted the administrative centers was one that we must imagine whispered through the chambers and courtyards. Who are these people, and from where do they truly come? What makes these earliest records so tantalizing is their very vagueness. The Egyptian chroniclers were experienced observers, accustomed to cataloging foreign peoples with ethnographic precision. They recorded the physical characteristics of Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, with a bureaucratic eye for detail. Yet when they turned their attention to these maritime raiders, something seems to have shifted in their certainty. The inscriptions describe weaponry that looked partially familiar and partially alien, ships that followed designs not quite Egyptian, not quite Levantine, warriors whose faces bore the marks of distant homelands, though which distant lands remained frustratingly unclear. The Hittites, that great Anatolian empire whose archives are among our most precious windows into the Bronze Age world, similarly began noting irregular maritime activity in their own period of correspondence. In the royal letters that have survived the millennia, preserved in the clay archives at the former capital of Hattusa, We find references to naval troubles, to coastal settlements being harassed, to an atmosphere of vulnerability where none had existed before. The seas, which had always been the great highway of connection and commerce, were beginning to feel like an avenue of threat. What is particularly striking about these early Hittite and Egyptian accounts is what they do not tell us. They do not describe a single, organized invasion force under a unified command. Rather, what emerges from reading between the lines of these official records is an impression of multiple raiding groups, operating sometimes in concert, sometimes independently, striking targets of opportunity along the Mediterranean coastlines. Some raids were clearly planned military operations. Others seem almost opportunistic, ships appearing in harbors, taking what could be taken, and vanishing back into the maritime vastness before significant resistance could be mounted. The Egyptian text that gives us perhaps the clearest early glimpse of this phenomenon speaks of disturbances in the 9th year of Merneptah's reign, when these unnamed raiders were noted attacking settlements in the Delta region and along the Syrian coast. The account is relatively calm in tone, as if the pharaoh and his scribes believed they had the situation well in hand. There is no apocalyptic language, no sense that the world was teetering on the edge of collapse. Instead, there is merely the notation of a problem that required administrative attention and military response. This makes it, in a peculiar way, even more haunting than if the records had shrieked of catastrophe, because what we are reading is the moment before anyone truly understood what was coming. The identity question shadows all of these early reports like a ghost that will not be named. The raiders are described by their actions and their origins, those who came from the islands, the seafaring peoples, those of the north, but the precision stops there. The scribes knew the names of kings. They knew the names of known foes. But these maritime warriors seemed to have no centralized authority that the Egyptians could identify, no single homeland that could be clearly marked on their maps of the known world. It is as though the very act of naming had become impossible, and in that impossibility lies a clue to the deeper strangeness of their nature. Some scholars have speculated that these early raiders may not have been unified at all, but rather a coalition of desperate groups, refugees, mercenaries, displaced populations, driven by circumstances that the official records do not bother to explain. Others have suggested that they were well-organized corsairs, moving between home bases and raiding territories with practiced precision, and that the Egyptians' inability to pinpoint their origins was simply a failure of intelligence gathering on the part of the administration. The truth, as with so much of this era, likely contains elements of both possibility and remains stubbornly beyond the reach of certainty. What these first shadowy appearances do tell us, however, is that the great powers of the Bronze Age were beginning to experience something unprecedented, an enemy that could not be easily categorized or contained within the existing frameworks of diplomatic and military understanding. The centuries-old order of the Mediterranean, with its established hierarchies and known adversaries, its understood protocols of conflict and negotiation, was being disrupted by something fluid, something that did not announce itself through proper channels or declare its intentions through ambassadors and formal declarations. The sea, which had always been a space of connection, was becoming a space of rupture. And in the decades that followed these first tentative records, that rupture would widen into an abyss. Now, to understand how these shadowy raiders became known, or rather, unknown, to history, we must journey backward through time to a figure whose name echoes across millennia with almost legendary weight. Ramesses II, whom the Greeks would call Ozymandias, ruled Egypt during a period when the Mediterranean world still hummed with the kind of power and certainty that precedes collapse. His reign was long, his monuments vast, and his military reach considerable. And yet, embedded within the records of his greatest military triumph, lies a peculiar detail, one that historians have only recently begun to understand as a key to unlocking the mystery of these raiders from the sea. The year was approximately 1274 before the Common Era, when Ramesses marched northward with his armies toward a place called Kadesh, a strategic city in what we now call Syria. His great rival was the Hittite Empire under Muwatalli, a power that had long contested Egyptian influence in the Levantine coastal regions. This was not a war born of sudden invasion or chaos. It was the culmination of decades of territorial ambition, of old empires reaching across the Mediterranean, testing each other's strength like wrestlers who have circled for so long they have forgotten why they began. What makes this moment so remarkable, what whispers to us across the centuries with such quiet insistence, is something that Ramesses himself recorded on the walls of his temples. Among his own soldiers, among those who fought beneath the Egyptian banners at Kadesh, were warriors with names that echo in later accounts of the sea peoples themselves. The Sherdun, the Lebu, groups described as foreign mercenaries, hired soldiers whose loyalty was purchased rather than born of patriotic fervor. These men fought in the ranks of Ramesses's army, and in doing so, they reveal something profound. The crisis we associate with the end of the Bronze Age did not emerge suddenly from nowhere, like raiders born fully armed from sea foam. It had been fermenting, building, manifesting itself long before in the movements of peoples, in the commerce of violence, in the slow dissolution of the old order's ability to command absolute loyalty. Consider what this tells us about the world of the late Bronze Age, that moment when empires still seemed eternal and their power unquestionable. The armies of great pharaohs and kings were not composed solely of native subjects, nor were they staffed entirely by professional soldiers who inherited their positions through family or birthright. Instead, there was a constant circulation of martial talent, a flow of warriors and soldiers who moved from one master to another, seeking payment, seeking plunder, seeking the kind of authority that came only from the strength of one's sword arm. The Sherdun, those figures who would later be accused of descending upon the coasts of Egypt like locusts, fought as mercenaries in Ramesses' own forces. How very strange, and how very telling. These mercenary soldiers were not isolated figures, anomalies in an otherwise unified military structure. Rather, they represent a broader pattern, one that historians have come to recognize as characteristic of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. The great empires, despite their reputation for absolute control and centralized authority, were in fact deeply dependent on networks of soldiers for hire, on men whose primary loyalty belonged not to a distant king, but to whoever paid them most recently. This created a kind of perpetual instability, a floating population of warriors who drifted across the sea routes and trade networks, available to the highest bidder. What happens, one might wonder, when the bidding stops, when the wealth that sustained these networks begins to contract, when the great powers can no longer afford to maintain their mercenary armies at full strength? The Battle of Kadesh itself was a near catastrophe for Ramesses. Egyptian accounts, recorded with their characteristic emphasis on royal triumph and divine favor, describe a victory, yet modern scholars reading between the lines of these inscriptions perceive something more complex, more ambiguous. The battle was ferocious and inconclusive. Ramesses escaped what might have been a disastrous defeat, thanks partly to the timely arrival of reinforcements. In the end, both sides claimed victory, and the two empires negotiated a peace that would endure for decades. But the significance of what occurred at Kadesh was not merely in the clash of armies or the exchange of territory. It was in the very fact of the clash itself, proof that the Mediterranean world was beginning to fracture, that the old imperial consensus was weakening, that competition for resources and power was becoming more intense, more volatile. The Sherdun who fought beneath the Egyptian banner at Kadesh were part of a much larger phenomenon, one that spanned generations and eventually transformed the entire character of Mediterranean civilization. They were skilled warriors apparently, noted enough in Egyptian records to be distinguished by name and origin, but more importantly, they were available. They were peripatetic. They were not tied to a single homeland or a single monarch by bonds that could not be broken. In a world where stability still seemed assured, where great empires still controlled the trade routes and commanded immense wealth, the presence of mercenary groups like the Sherdun seemed like merely a practical arrangement. a way for powerful kings to augment their military forces with experienced foreign troops. It was an economical solution to a military need, unremarkable and commonplace. Yet from a certain perspective, these mercenary soldiers already were the sea peoples, or rather, they represented the first visible manifestation of the phenomenon that would eventually bear that name. The raiders and invaders who would soon terrorize the coasts of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean were not entirely foreign to the established powers. Some of them had walked Egyptian soil as soldiers. Some of them had served under Egyptian command. Some of them had been fed and paid by the very empires they would later assault. The boundary between mercenary and invader, between hired soldier and raider, was far more permeable than the later accounts would suggest, far more ambiguous than the stark language of invasion and conquest could ever fully capture. And so we turn our attention now to one of the great empires of the ancient world, the Hittites, whose reach extended across Anatolia and into the Levant, whose diplomacy shaped the known world, whose records we have learned to read and treasure. Imagine, if you will, the highland capital of Hattusa, set among the rocky slopes of central Turkey, a city that had endured for centuries, that had seen kings and priests and scribes move through its temples and palaces, leaving behind the clay tablets that tell us so much of what they feared and valued and believed. In the waning decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, this fortress city, this seat of imperial power, was suddenly abandoned, not gradually diminished, not slowly depopulated over generations, but emptied, as if some threshold had been crossed that made remaining there unthinkable. The archaeological evidence speaks to us in silence. The city was destroyed. We can see the burn layers, the collapsed walls, the ash that settled on what had been daily life. Yet here is where the mystery deepens, where certainty begins to fray at its edges. Who caused this destruction? Was it the sea peoples, those raiders whose ships appeared on the horizon like a gathering storm? Or were they merely one piece, perhaps even a secondary consequence, of forces far larger and more diffuse than any single invading force could represent? The scribes of Hattusa left no final testament, no desperate letter crying out for military aid, as we shall later hear from other doomed cities. The palace archives simply end, the records stop, and in that silence, archaeologists and historians must piece together a narrative from fragments, from the few surviving tablets, from the physical traces of fire and destruction, from what we can infer about the broader pressures that were mounting across the Mediterranean world in those final years of the Bronze Age. The great king who presided over what may have been Hattusa's final decades was Shuppiluliuma II, and though his name appears in some inscriptions, his reign remains shadowy to us, difficult to reconstruct with confidence. We do not know the exact sequence of events that led to the city's fall. We cannot say with certainty whether he died in battle, whether he fled, whether he ruled long or briefly before the end came. What we can observe is the broader pattern of collapse. One after another, the great palace centers that had defined the late Bronze Age began to fail. In Mycenaean Greece, the palatial systems that had flourished for centuries started their descent into ruin. On Cyprus, the wealthy trading centers that had grown rich on copper and commerce experienced sudden destruction. In the Levant, cities that had stood for generations found themselves under attack. And in the scholarly world, a long debate has unfolded about cause and effect, about whether we are witnessing the results of invasion or the catastrophic breakdown of systems that had become too fragile, too dependent on trade networks that were themselves fragmenting. Some scholars argue that the destruction of Hattusa was indeed the work of the sea peoples, that these raiders struck at the heart of Hittite power and brought the empire to its knees. The evidence seems to support invasion. There is destruction. There are signs of violence. There are the later Egyptian records that speak of these mysterious groups causing havoc across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet others suggest a more complex picture, one in which the Hittite Empire was already weakening, already struggling with internal pressures, with famine perhaps, with the strains of maintaining control over far-flung territories. The sea peoples, from this perspective, arrived at a moment of vulnerability and administered a final blow to a structure that was already beginning to collapse under its own weight. Consider the physical remains of Hattusa as archaeologists have uncovered them. The destruction is real enough, the burned buildings, the toppled stones. But consider too the manner of this destruction. Some rooms show evidence of careful dismantling before burning, as if someone was deliberately taking the palace apart rather than fighting a desperate final battle within its walls. Other areas show signs of conflagration so complete that it seems less like the aftermath of combat and more like a systematic burning. What does this tell us? Perhaps that the end came in various ways, at various moments, that the city did not fall in a single day, but rather was gradually overwhelmed, abandoned, burned by different hands at different times. Perhaps some of the destruction was wrought by invaders, and some by inhabitants who chose to leave nothing for their enemies to use. The fate of the population remains deeply uncertain. Did they flee to safer regions? Were they killed? Were they absorbed into whatever new order emerged from the chaos? The absence of skeletal remains and mass graves suggests that at least some survived, that they escaped before the final destruction, that Hattusa's end was not accompanied by wholesale slaughter. Yet we cannot be certain of even this most basic fact. What we do know is that the Hittite Empire, in its formal political sense, ceased to exist. The great structures of imperial administration vanished. The diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and other powers ended. The imperial cult and religious practices that had sustained royal authority dissolved into history. Whether the Sea Peoples were the primary cause of this collapse, or whether they were rather the scavengers who arrived to exploit an empire already dying, remains a question that honest scholars must admit they cannot fully answer with the evidence we possess. The truth is likely more subtle than either extreme, likely involving both external pressure from raiders and internal systems failures that had accumulated over decades. But the narrative is incomplete, and perhaps will always remain so, and there is something almost restful in accepting that some mysteries of the ancient world will not yield to certainty, that some stories remain genuinely unfinished, suspended in the amber of time between knowing and not knowing. There is a city that burned so completely that its story nearly vanished from the world, leaving behind only fragments of clay and the faintest echoes of human desperation frozen in ash. That city was Ugarit, and though we cannot hear the voices of those who died there, we can read the words they wrote in their final hours. Ugarit lay on the coast of what is now Syria, a place where the Mediterranean's warm breath and the riches of inland trade routes converged into extraordinary wealth. For centuries it had been a thriving port, a place where merchants from Egypt and the Hittite Empire and the distant Mycenaean kingdoms came to exchange tin and cedar and precious oils. The streets were lined with workshops where craftspeople made pottery and dyed fabrics. The harbor was busy with ships. The palace was full of scribes who kept careful records of everything: inventories, treaties, letters, the daily business of a prosperous kingdom speaking in at least 3 languages. Then, in the final years of the 12th century before the Common Era, the tone of those letters changed. Imagine standing in the archives of Ugarit, moving past clay tablets written in cuneiform, and noticing that something had shifted in the language itself. Where once there had been treaties and reports of successful trade, there now appeared messages written in urgency, in fragments, in a kind of breathless haste. One tablet, dated to what scholars believe was near the very end, contains a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, which is almost certainly the island of Cyprus, a neighboring power across the sea. The letter is short. It speaks of something coming, something that has already begun to unfold. The kingdom was asking for help. It was asking for ships. Ships. The word pulses through that ancient message like a heartbeat. In a time when invasion came from the water, when ships meant either trade or terror, the absence of ships was catastrophic. Ugarit was vulnerable. The letter does not panic. The tone is formal, restrained, the language of kings speaking to kings. But beneath that formality, there is something unmistakable. There is fear. Another tablet, equally desperate, speaks of grain. The stores were running low. Ships that should have arrived were missing. Whether they had been captured or destroyed, or simply diverted to other ports as the region descended into chaos, the record does not tell us, but the implication is clear. Ugarit was beginning to starve. It needed grain to survive the coming season, and grain came by ship, and ships were no longer arriving. Think of what those words meant to the people living within the city walls. The prosperity that had felt permanent was becoming fragile. The trade routes that had made the kingdom rich were becoming unsafe. Young men were called to defend the harbor. Merchants stopped loading their goods. The rhythm of daily life, the busy markets, the evening meetings in the taverns by the docks, the ordinary small exchanges that make a city feel alive, all of it began to falter. And then, with a speed that still astounds archaeologists, Ugarit ceased to exist. The city was attacked, burned, and largely abandoned. Its destruction dated to around 1185 BCE, though the exact year remains a matter of gentle scholarly debate. The heat of the fire was so intense that the clay tablets were hardened and preserved, turning what might have been a total loss into an accidental archive. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 20th century, they found the palace with its storerooms, and in those rooms, they found evidence of a city caught in its final moments. Grain storage containers lay where they had been overturned. There were signs of ash and charring. There were broken weapons, scattered as if dropped in haste or conflict. But most poignantly, there were more letters that had been written and perhaps never sent, or sent and never received. Messages to other kingdoms pleading for help, for supplies, for confirmation that aid was coming. And then, silence. The letters stopped. The scribes set down their pens. The archives fell silent. One of these letters was addressed to a neighbor, and it simply says that the enemy ships have appeared. Another mentions that the people have retreated into the city, abandoning the outer settlements. The tone suggests not a single moment of catastrophic invasion, but rather a grinding, terrifying sequence of events over weeks or months. A city watching its lifelines being cut one by one. A city's rulers writing increasingly urgent messages, each one perhaps wondering if this letter would be the last anyone would ever read. We do not know with complete certainty who these attackers were. The letters do not name them with the specificity that later Egyptian inscriptions would use for the sea peoples. But the circumstances, the coming from the sea, the speed of the destruction, the coincidence of Ugarit's fall with the broader collapse of late Bronze Age civilization, all of it suggests that these were the same groups that appear in the historical record of this era. Whether they were raiders or refugees themselves fleeing some unknown catastrophe, or mercenaries whose employment had dissolved into pure opportunism, the end result was the same. Ugarit's fall is significant, not because it was the only city to be destroyed in this period, it was not, but because we can read the human experience of it. We have not just the archaeological rubble, but the words written by people who were there, their handwriting on clay, their desperate appeals, their hope that help might still arrive. And we know that help never came. The ships did not return with grain. The promised reinforcements did not materialize. The city that had traded with the great powers of the age fell when those great powers were themselves fracturing, too preoccupied with their own survival to spare resources for a distant port. When we look at Ugarit, we are looking at something rare in ancient history. We are seeing not just the skeleton of a dead civilization, but a glimpse of the terror and bewilderment that its people felt as the world they had known began to collapse around them. The clay tablets tell us that they understood something was wrong. They wrote about it. They asked for help. They hoped. And then, almost impossibly quickly, for a city that had stood for centuries, it was gone. This pattern, this combination of anxiety followed by sudden destruction, followed by abandonment, would repeat itself again and again across the Mediterranean basin in these final years of the Bronze Age. Port after port, city after city, would find themselves writing desperate letters to neighbors who could not help, and one by one, they would fall silent. The walls of Thebes still stood tall when Merneptah ascended to the throne of Egypt, perhaps in his 60s, a king who had already lived long enough to watch his father Ramesses II reshape the world through sheer force of will and monument. But where his father had carved his name into cliff faces and temple walls with unshakable confidence, Merneptah would inherit something far more fragile, a realm beginning to feel the weight of pressures from every direction at once. And it was he, in the 5th year of his reign around 1208 BCE, who would leave us the most detailed written account we possess of these mysterious raiders from across the sea. The inscription appears on what historians call the Merneptah Stela, a slab of black granite standing in Thebes like a monument to confusion and clarity existing in the same breath. Upon it, the king commanded his scribes to record a great military victory, a triumph so complete and so overwhelming that it seemed to settle, at least temporarily, the question of Egypt's security. Yet what he actually described was less a single conquest, and more a desperate defense against a coordinated assault unlike anything Egypt had faced in living memory. The raiders did not come alone. They arrived in waves, in ships, and on foot, bringing not just warriors but families, cattle, carts laden with possessions. This was not a raid for plunder. This looked, increasingly, like an invasion. On the stela, Merneptah lists them by name, and here is where the puzzle truly begins to crystallize. He calls them the Libu, and these we can trace with reasonable certainty to Libyan peoples already familiar to Egyptian records, groups from the western deserts who had long pressed against the borders. But alongside the Libu, there were others, names that appear nowhere else with such clarity, as if they emerged from obscurity only to strike once and vanish into the mist of history. The Ekwesh, the Shekelesh, the Shurdan, the Teresh, the Weshesh. The scribes rendered these foreign names into Egyptian hieroglyphic script, doing their best to transliterate sounds from languages that did not belong to the Nile Valley, and in that very act of translation, we encounter our first opportunity to chase their origins. Think of it like listening to someone describe a place you've never been, watching them struggle to find words in your language for something that exists only in theirs. The sounds shift, the meanings blur at the edges, and sometimes, what emerges is something neither quite foreign nor quite familiar. This is the philological puzzle that scholars have spent 2 centuries trying to solve. Who were these people, truly? Where did they come from? And why did they appear on Egypt's doorstep with such apparent coordination and purpose? The Shurdan have drawn particular attention, partly because they appear in other records too, serving as mercenaries in the Egyptian army generations before Merneptah's time. Some linguists have proposed that their name derives from Sardinia, that island in the western Mediterranean that sits like a stone in the middle of the sea. If this is true, and the word if carries considerable weight here, then we are looking at warriors who may have traveled hundreds of miles from their homeland, learned Egyptian tactics and languages, served as hired soldiers for the pharaoh, and then, at some point, either rebelled or were displaced and joined a larger coalition of maritime peoples. Others suggest they came from the Aegean, from Cyprus, from Anatolia. The evidence dances just out of reach. The Ekwesh present a different mystery. Some scholars have wondered if their name connects to the Achaeans, that broad term Homer used to describe the Greek kingdoms of the Bronze Age, those Mycenaean powers whose palaces were beginning to crumble even as Merneptah wrote his triumph onto stone. Could they be Greeks, refugees, or warriors from a world in collapse, driven westward and southward by forces they did not understand? The connection remains speculative, based on the shape of syllables and the haunting possibility that history's greatest upheavals sometimes set people in motion across distances we find almost impossible to imagine. The Teresh and Weshesh remain even more elusive. Their names do not yield easily to modern ears or to linguistic analysis. Perhaps they came from Anatolia, from the regions once dominated by the Hittites whose empire was itself teetering on the edge of oblivion. Perhaps they represented splinter groups, or disenfranchised mercenaries whose services were no longer needed as empires contracted and fell. The names might be corrupted by transmission, altered by scribes doing their best to render foreign tongues into Egyptian consonants. Each theory gains or loses favor depending on the scholar you consult and the archaeological evidence they choose to weight most heavily. What strikes the careful listener to these ancient records is that Merneptah's inscription, for all its claims of overwhelming victory, actually reveals something more complicated beneath its boastful surface. He tells us that these peoples attacked his territory and that he defeated them. He provides numbers that historians have learned to treat with considerable skepticism, for ancient military records were often inflated to glorify the victor. But he does not tell us that the threat vanished, that peace returned, that the borders were secured once and for all. In the generations immediately following, the pressure would only increase. What we might call the identity puzzle, the question of who these people truly were, becomes easier to approach if we stop thinking of them as a unified ethnic group with a single homeland. Instead, imagine them as a confederation, a coalition of necessity, sailors and soldiers from different maritime regions, perhaps already displaced by the upheavals affecting the eastern Mediterranean, united by circumstance and opportunity. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, simply because that was the most obvious thing about them. They came from the sea, they attacked from the sea, they represented a kind of mobility and power that land-based kingdoms could not easily counter. To Merneptah and his generals, their names mattered less than the threat they posed. The inscriptions on the stela also mention something equally interesting, something that shifts the lens slightly. Alongside the foreign raiders, the Libu included, Merneptah's inscription speaks of disturbance within Egypt's own borders, unrest among populations within the Nile Valley itself. Could it be that these external attacks found purchase because internal stability had already begun to fray? The question hangs in the air like incense smoke in a temple at dusk. The answer, if one exists, lies scattered across the fragmentary records of the era, in the gaps between what was written and what was lived, in the spaces where history becomes silence. The Great Crisis came under Ramesses III, and it arrived with a force that no earlier skirmish had carried. Around 1180 BCE, perhaps a decade or so after the inscriptions of his predecessor, the incoming tide shifted from raid to something far more deliberate, an organized assault on Egypt itself, and on the very waters and shores that had always protected the kingdom. The reliefs that survived at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III in Thebes, preserve for us the visual record of what occurred in those months, carved into stone by artists who had stood perhaps in the presence of those who witnessed the events themselves. Imagine, if you will, what those artisans chose to immortalize. The Battle of the Delta, they called it, and the battle came in two movements, one upon the water, one upon the land. The reliefs show us Egyptian ships and enemy vessels locked in a terrible choreography, oars and bows rendered in that distinctive profile view that Egyptian sculptors perfected across centuries. The Sea People's vessels in these carvings appear crowded, their hulls rounded differently from the Egyptian galleys, their crews manning what may have been distinctive sails, though scholars continue to pass exactly what the stylized depictions tell us. The Egyptian artists, understandably, emphasized their own navy's triumph, but what emerges from even a careful reading of these images is the sheer scale of the threat. Dozens of enemy ships bearing down on the delta, the mouths of the Nile where Egypt's greatest cities clustered, and where the grain that fed civilization itself was harvested. The pharaoh's forces, according to both the reliefs and the accompanying inscriptions, were ready. Ramesses III appears to have anticipated the assault, positioned his navy to intercept the incoming fleet before it could establish a foothold on Egyptian soil. The reliefs show Egyptian archers loosing arrows into the enemy ships, show grappling hooks and nets, show scenes of chaos aboard the vessels, men falling into the churning water, ships capsizing, the terrible mathematics of naval warfare rendered in stone. The Egyptian navy, disciplined and battle-hardened, succeeded in repelling much of the sea assault, turning back a significant portion of the invading fleet before it could land. But here is what deepens the story into something far more complex and troubling. The Sea Peoples did not stop, they regrouped. They landed their forces on the coast and began a second campaign, this time on land, moving inland toward the heartland of Egypt itself. This transition from naval assault to terrestrial invasion speaks to a sophistication of strategy that complicates any simple reading of these invaders as mere raiders or desperate refugees fleeing famine. They had brought their families, their possessions, their livestock. The reliefs show women and children and ox-drawn carts, which some scholars interpret as evidence of a genuine migration, a people seeking not to plunder, but to settle. Yet they came armed, they came organized, and they came in the tens of thousands. The land battle, as depicted in the Medinet Habu reliefs, unfolds with a grim intensity. Egyptian soldiers advance in tight formation, shields overlapping, spears and swords thrust forward. The enemy warriors, drawn in a different style to emphasize their foreignness, appear to wear distinctive headgear, feathered crowns or crested helmets that mark them as outsiders in the artistic vocabulary of the time. Some are armed with swords that seem longer, broader than the Egyptian blades. Some carry spears. They advance in looser formations than the Egyptian phalanx, which may suggest different tactical traditions, or which may simply reflect Egyptian artistic convention. How much of what we see in these carvings is literal documentation, and how much is ideological messaging, the projection of Egyptian order against foreign chaos, remains a question that even the most careful Egyptologist cannot entirely resolve. The inscriptions that accompany these reliefs speak of a great victory. Ramesses III, they tell us, defeated the Sea Peoples on multiple fronts. He repelled them from the waters, he turned back their land invasion, he captured thousands of prisoners, and took their weapons and their ships. The pharaoh speaks of the gods intervening on behalf of Egypt, of divine protection granted to the kingdom. Yet what emerges from reading these sources with a calm and unflinching eye is not a picture of an enemy easily dismissed or thoroughly crushed, but rather of a threat that required the full marshalling of Egyptian military resources, that tested the kingdom's defenses in a way that earlier invasions and raids had not. The fact that such detailed records were made, that the pharaoh commissioned monumental reliefs documenting these events, itself speaks to their significance. The aftermath of the Battle of the Delta reveals something curious and somewhat ambiguous. Ramesses III claims to have taken many Sea Peoples as prisoners. The inscriptions mention specific groups, names that scholars now recognize as correlating with some of the names listed in the Meneptah stele decades earlier. Among these prisoners, it appears, the pharaoh settled some as military colonists, as foreign troops serving in the Egyptian army. This practice was not entirely new. Egypt had long employed foreign soldiers, yet the scale and the specificity here suggest something different. Some of these former enemies became integrated into Egyptian society, their descendants living in Egypt, some eventually intermarrying with Egyptian families. Does this represent a pragmatic solution to a military manpower problem, or does it suggest something more complex about the nature of these invaders? Were they enemies to be defeated, or were they refugees, migrants, soldiers of fortune whose integration into Egyptian service represented a workable compromise? The sources themselves remain ambiguous on this point. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Ramesses III's victory, whatever its ultimate character, came at considerable cost. The king's reign saw internal strife, labor strikes among the workers who built and maintained the monuments, signs of strain on the Egyptian economy and the state apparatus itself. The great temple workers of the Valley of the Kings went unpaid, recorded their grievances in writing, the earliest known strike records in human history, and this discontent may well have been connected to the massive military expenditures required to repel the Sea People's threat. Resources that might have gone to sustaining the elaborate bureaucracy and cultural institutions that had always defined Egyptian civilization were instead diverted to defense, to the maintenance of armies and navies. What emerges from the Egyptian inscriptions, if you sit with them long enough, is not clarity, but rather the shadowy outline of particular peoples, each named, each distinct in some way that mattered deeply to the scribes recording them. The Egyptians, for all their administrative precision, gave us fragments, individual names, and here is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves, because each name has been chased by scholars across decades, each one trailing theories and counter-theories like threads through an ancient labyrinth that may or may not lead anywhere at all. The Peliset arrive first in the records, and they arrive with a certain prominence that cannot be ignored. Ramesses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu speak of them with a weight that suggests they were neither small nor insignificant, and over time, scholars began to notice something intriguing. The name Peliset, when you turn it over in your mouth, when you listen to how it might have sounded to an Egyptian ear, carries echoes of something that survived long after the Bronze Age ended. The Philistines, the people who would eventually settle in Canaan, who would give their name to the land itself, Palestine. The consonantal structure, the historical geography, the timing of their appearance in the archaeological record, all of these things seem to align, and yet this remains contested. Some scholars embrace the Peliset to Philistine connection as nearly certain, while others urge caution, pointing out that names can migrate, can be corrupted, can arrive by coincidence rather than descent. The truth may lie somewhere in that uncertain middle ground, in the possibility that the Peliset contributed significantly to the population that would become the Philistines, but were not the whole story of their origins. Then there are the Checker, a people whose name appears with less frequency, but persistent enough to suggest a real historical presence. Where did they come from? Where did they go? The archaeological evidence hints towards Cyprus, and the Aegean, towards seafaring communities whose homes may have been scattered across islands, but the certainty fragments when you reach for it. Some scholars propose connections to known Cypriot populations, others to Anatolian peoples displaced from the collapsing Hittite sphere. The Checker may have been mercenaries, may have been refugees, may have been opportunists riding the chaos. We do not know their own story about themselves. We know only what Egyptian scribes chose to record, and that is never the whole truth. The Denyen present another puzzle, one that has captured the imagination of scholars in particular, because the name seems to hover very close to something recognizable. The Danyans. The Greeks of Homer's epics, the people who sailed to Troy. Could it be? The linguistic distance is small enough to suggest a real connection, yet large enough to leave room for doubt. Were the Denyen actually Mycenaean Greeks, or peoples influenced by Mycenaean culture, or something else entirely that merely sounded similar to Egyptian ears? The question matters because it would change everything about how we understand the interconnectedness of the crisis. If the Denyen were indeed Greek, then the collapse of Mycenaean civilization and the movements of the sea peoples become not separate phenomena, but intertwined. A single catastrophe, fragmenting outward in multiple directions at once. The Shurden appear again and again in the records, and they possess a curious history all their own. They served Ramesses II as mercenaries before they appear as adversaries under Ramesses III, and this shift, from employed soldiers to raiders, suggests something about the fluidity and desperation of the age. Their connection to Sardinia seems plausible to some scholars, the name carrying echoes of an island identity, though others argue this is too neat, too convenient. Perhaps the Shurden were simply warriors for hire, whose origins mattered less than their martial skill, and perhaps over time, as fortunes changed and empires weakened, they stopped serving and started taking. The Weshesh remain among the most enigmatic, their identity contested, and their origins obscure. Possible connections to Anatolian peoples, to Cypriot populations, to yet unknown maritime cultures have all been proposed, and none has achieved consensus. They may have been distinct in their origins, or they may have been a confederation, a temporary gathering of displaced peoples, united by circumstance and opportunity, rather than by genuine kinship. This uncertainty itself becomes fascinating when you sit with it, when you realize that the Weshesh might never be definitively identified, might remain forever a shadow in the historical record, named but never truly known. What strikes the mind, as you contemplate these 5 names, Peliset, Checker, Denyen, Shurden, Weshesh, is how they represent not a single unified sea people's identity, but rather a collection of groups, each with its own history, each arriving at the crisis moment of 1200 BCE from potentially different directions and for potentially different reasons. The Egyptian scribes grouped them together because they arrived from the sea, because they appeared as threats or soldiers depending on the moment. But this grouping may tell us more about how the Egyptians understood invasion and foreignness than about who these peoples actually were. Some scholars have become convinced that the names map onto specific homelands with reasonable confidence. The Philistines emerged in Canaan and claimed a distinct identity through the archaeological record, their pottery and material culture bearing marks of Aegean influence. Others, like the Checker and Weshesh, seem to have assimilated more completely into existing populations, or to have dispersed widely enough that their traces became indistinguishable from the broader disruption of the age. And some names may represent groups that disappeared entirely, leaving no descendants, no continuation, no archaeological footprint substantial enough to find. The competing theories circle around these identities, like birds around carrion, each scholar arguing for different homelands and different migrations. But beneath the disagreement lies something more fundamental, the recognition that we are trying to recover the biographies of peoples from the scraps that survived, and those scraps are fragmentary at best. A name on an Egyptian temple wall, a style of pottery that might indicate cultural exchange or actual settlement. The hints of mercenary service followed by the absence of any further record. From these fragments, we are attempting to construct entire histories, entire journeys across the Mediterranean world. This is the work of archaeology and philology at their most humbling. This is where certainty dissolves and possibility takes its place. Each name, each theory, each proposed connection represents someone's best effort to draw a line through the chaos and create meaning from discontinuity. But perhaps meaning lies not in definitively answering who the sea peoples were, but rather in understanding that they were many things, many peoples, whose stories converged upon a single moment of crisis without ever becoming truly unified. They were names on walls, traces in the archaeological record, the shadows of journeys we can never fully recover, the echoes of decisions made in desperation by people whose own understanding of who they were may have been no clearer than ours is now. And so we arrive now at the ground itself, the earth where these people actually lived, worked, and left behind the material echoes of their presence. For if the names in inscriptions remain tantalizingly distant, the pottery they made speaks with a kind of physical clarity that no scribe's hand can entirely obscure. Consider the fragments found in the sandy layers of Canaan, particularly in the southern coastal regions around Gaza and Ascalon. There, mixed among the ruins of late Bronze Age settlements, archaeologists have uncovered a distinctive style of ceramic vessels that stands apart from what came before. The shapes are different. The decorations follow new patterns. The clay itself sometimes seems to come from unfamiliar sources, and when examined under the slow, careful eye of modern analysis, these pots whisper of origins somewhere across the sea, most likely from the Aegean world of the Mycenaeans and their neighbors. The Philistine pottery, as it has come to be known, carries within its very form a kind of frozen migration story. The designs show geometric patterns and birds and stylized figures that echo what we find in late Mycenaean Greece. Monochrome linear drawings on a background of slipped clay. Spiral motifs, spirals within spirals, like waves endlessly rolling. And yet the Philistine version begins to evolve, to blend with local Canaanite traditions, suggesting not a simple transplantation of culture, but rather a gradual accommodation, a slow process of settling and adapting to new land. This transformation across pottery styles is precisely the kind of evidence that silent archaeological layers can provide when written records fall silent. The pots do not lie, they do not exaggerate or honor the political interests of any particular pharaoh. Yet here already we must pause and acknowledge the fundamental uncertainty that surrounds even this tangible evidence. For while the pottery suggests Aegean connections, it does not prove invasion. It does not prove sudden displacement or violent conquest. The appearance of foreign ceramics might indicate trade. It might suggest the arrival of small groups of settlers who merged peacefully into existing populations. It might even reflect the adoption of foreign styles by local potters, a kind of cultural fashion spreading through merchant networks rather than through military occupation. Some scholars have proposed that the Philistines arrived as mercenaries hired by the Egyptian pharaohs, settled perhaps in designated garrison towns, and then, once the empire weakened, simply remained and established themselves as a permanent population. The pottery would be consistent with such a scenario. Other researchers suggest a more turbulent picture, arguing that the presence of certain destruction layers immediately above or intermixed with these foreign ceramics indicates that conquest and conflict did occur, that settlements were burnt and rebuilt by newcomers, that the transformation was not entirely peaceful. The challenge, you see, is that pottery and archaeological stratigraphy are mute witnesses. They can tell us what, and sometimes when, but they struggle to explain why or how societies actually changed hands. A burnt layer might indicate warfare, but it might also indicate accidental fire, or conflict between local populations, or ritual destruction, or simple decline followed by burning of abandoned structures. The pottery changes, yes, but was it brought by invaders, or acquired through trade? Did entire populations migrate, or did smaller groups integrate into larger communities? Did intermarriage occur rapidly, smoothly blending populations, or did tension persist for generations? The Earth keeps its silence on these questions. Archaeological work at sites like Ascalon has revealed cemeteries containing burials that appear consistent with Aegean or Anatolian practice, rather than strictly Canaanite custom. The bodies were sometimes cremated rather than inhumed, and the grave goods suggest different religious beliefs, or at least different ceremonial traditions. These burials offer another thread of evidence, another whisper suggesting that peoples from the north and west did indeed arrive in the Levantine coast and establish communities there. Yet even cremation practices can spread through cultural contact and do not necessarily prove anything about the scale or nature of migration. Small communities of foreigners might adopt local burial customs within a generation or two, erasing their own traditions in the geological record. Alternatively, local communities might adopt foreign practices selectively, creating a confused archaeological picture that reflects neither pure migration nor simple indigenous continuity. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: by the 12th century before the Common Era, settlements in Canaan, particularly in the coastal and southern regions, show clear material evidence of Aegean or Mediterranean contact. Whether this contact was brief or prolonged, whether it involved a handful of traders or thousands of settlers, whether it was peaceful or violent, remains genuinely uncertain. Different archaeological teams examining the same sites have reached different conclusions. Some point to destruction layers and burnt buildings as evidence of conquest. Others note that many settlements continued without obvious signs of violent interruption. That change seems gradual in some places rather than sudden. And then there is the matter of interpretation itself. An archaeologist working with a theoretical framework that emphasizes large-scale migration and systemic collapse might interpret the evidence differently from a colleague predisposed to seeing continuity and gradual cultural change. The truth, perhaps, is that the process was neither simple nor uniform. Different regions may have experienced different degrees of disruption. Some coastal cities may have suffered dramatic destruction, while inland settlements continued relatively unchanged. Some communities may have been violently displaced, while others peacefully incorporated foreign settlers. The Aegean peoples who arrived in the Levant did not all experience the same journey or face the same circumstances upon arrival. Those who came as organized military contingents, backed by Egyptian authority, would have had a very different experience than those who arrived as refugees fleeing collapse in their homelands. And those experiences, layered across decades and centuries, become compressed into the material record, leaving behind evidence that fragments and resists clean interpretation. As we sift through these archaeological layers, then, we encounter not so much revelation as refinement of mystery. The pottery connects these distant peoples. The burial practices suggest their presence. The destruction layers hint at conflict, but the fuller narrative of who they were, where exactly they came from, why they moved, and how they integrated into new populations remains largely a matter of careful inference, educated speculation, and honest acknowledgement of what the archaeological record cannot tell us. And in that space between evidence and interpretation, between what we find and what we understand, lies much of the endless fascination this ancient mystery continues to hold. And yet, as the dust of these battles settles in the mind, a quieter question begins to emerge from the archaeological silence. What if the sea peoples were not the architects of collapse, but merely the turbulent foam atop a much deeper wave of change? What if the entire world was already fracturing, long before any fleet appeared on the horizon? In recent decades, scholars have turned their attention away from the simple narrative of invasion towards something far more complex and, in many ways, more haunting. The evidence suggests that the late Bronze Age world was gripped by forces that no military strategy could overcome. The Mediterranean itself, it seems, was turning against human civilization. Around the very time when Egyptian and Hittite records speak of sea peoples and raids, other records tell a different story entirely. Tree rings, those ancient keepers of climate memory, reveal that the Mediterranean experienced a period of profound cooling and instability. Harvests failed. The very seasons became unreliable. Imagine, for a moment, the terror not of an invader's blade, but of watching your stored grain rot, year after year, while your children's bellies grew hollow. That terror was real, and it was spreading. Archaeological layers across the Levant and Cyprus show evidence of massive earthquakes occurring during this same period. These were not minor tremors. Entire cities were shaken. The great harbor of Ugarit, which we saw through the eyes of its desperate scribes, may have been rendered partially unusable, not by fire and sword, but by geological upheaval. Stone walls that had stood for centuries crumbled. Water sources were disrupted. The carefully balanced systems of trade that held the Bronze Age together began, quite literally, to crack. Drought followed. Climate scientists have reconstructed the atmospheric conditions of the 12th century before the Common Era, and the picture they paint is one of sustained, regional drying. In Egypt, the Nile itself, that eternal river upon which the entire civilization depended, became unpredictable. Flood levels dropped. Harvests diminished. A civilization that had endured for 3,000 years suddenly found itself struggling to feed its own people. Can you sense the desperation that would have filled the courts and temples? The grain storehouses, once full to bursting, were opening to empty air. And here is where the sea peoples enter the story in a new light. They may not have been the cause of the collapse. They may, instead, have been symptoms of it. Refugees themselves, perhaps. Desperate populations displaced by the very same climate catastrophes that were destroying the established powers. Driven from their homes by drought, by failed harvests, by earthquakes that turned their world into rubble, they took to the seas not out of conquest, but out of survival. They arrived at the borders of established kingdoms, not as organized military forces, but as waves of desperate, hungry, displaced people, seeking any place that might still have food, water, shelter. When viewed through this lens, the raids take on a different character. They were not the lightning strike of a coordinated enemy campaign, but the chaotic spillover of a system in total collapse. People were moving. Resources were drying up. The great palaces that had ruled for centuries were empty, not because an invader had conquered them, but because there was nothing left to rule. No surplus to maintain the elaborate bureaucracies, no grain to trade, no reason for merchants to continue their long voyages across increasingly dangerous seas. The evidence for this systemic collapse theory comes from multiple sources. all pointing in the same direction. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric particles from this period, and they tell of volcanic eruptions, massive explosions that would have dimmed the sun and disrupted weather patterns across the entire planet. The Hittite Empire, remember, suddenly abandoned its great capital, but the letters they left behind speak not of invasion, but of hunger. An empire does not evacuate its most important city because of a few raiders. An empire evacuates when it can no longer feed itself. Consider the domino pattern of collapse. Mycenaean Greece fell. Cyprus emptied. The Levantine kingdoms crumbled. Hittite Anatolia was abandoned. Egypt itself did not disappear, but it contracted, pulled inward, weakened. This was not the pattern of a coordinated invasion from the sea. This was the pattern of a world system failing all at once. It is the difference between a kingdom losing a war and a kingdom losing the ability to sustain itself. Some scholars now propose that what we call the invasions of the sea peoples were, in reality, the final symptom of a much larger disease. Famine created refugees. Refugees created pressure on borders. The pressure on borders created conflict. The conflict accelerated the already precipitous decline of established powers. It was a cascade, a waterfall of causation, not a single arrow shot from the sea. And yet, the mystery does not vanish entirely. It only deepens. For if the world was already failing, why did it fail so completely, and so suddenly? Why did civilizations that had survived droughts before, that had weathered earthquakes and wars, suddenly collapse entirely? There is something almost inexplicable about the totality of it. It is as though, at a certain threshold, the accumulated stress on these systems simply became too much to bear. One more drought, one more earthquake, one more season of failed harvests, and then, suddenly, the whole edifice came down. The sea peoples appear in this story as both participants and witnesses. They emerge from the chaos that was already unfolding. They are caught in the same wave of collapse that destroyed the powers they raided. They were not the cause, they were, perhaps, part of the effect. And understanding this distinction, this shift from thinking of them as invaders to thinking of them as displaced peoples caught in a global catastrophe, transforms how we understand the entire era. The question then becomes not, who were the sea peoples, but rather, what happened to the world that forced people to flee their homes by the thousands, to take to the seas, to abandon everything they had ever known? What happened when the first palatial centers began to fall was less like the sudden breaking of a great edifice, and more like watching dominoes placed across an entire world tip slowly, inexorably, one after another. The palaces that had stood for centuries, the monuments to the wealth and order of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, did not all collapse in a single year, or even a single generation. Instead, their disappearance was a prolonged dimming, a slow extinguishing of lights across a vast geography, and that very gradualness makes it somehow more haunting to contemplate. In Mycenaean Greece, the great palace complexes that had risen at Mycenae itself, at Pylos, at Tiryns, these centers of political and economic power that had dominated the mainland for over 1,000 years, they were abandoned, not all at once, and not with absolute uniformity, but across the span of perhaps a century or two. The great halls fell silent. The Linear B tablets that had recorded the administrative life of these palaces, the inventories, and the names, and the careful bureaucratic accounting, they simply stopped. No more scribes bent over clay surfaces, no more voices in the megaron. The buildings themselves were sometimes burned, sometimes left to the slow work of decay and erosion, but what matters most is that they were no longer the centers of a living civilization. The populations that had once thrived there scattered, migrated, or diminished. What had been a coherent political and economic system fragmenting into smaller, more local, more precarious communities. Cyprus, once a glittering jewel in the Bronze Age Mediterranean trade network, experienced something equally profound. The late Bronze Age settlements of Cyprus had been intensely cosmopolitan places. You could find evidence there of Egyptian contact, Hittite influence, Mycenaean pottery, and the local Cypriot traditions woven together in a rich tapestry of exchange. The great centers like Enkomi were flourishing in the late 13th century, yet within a few generations, that prosperity seemed to evaporate. Population centers shifted inland, away from the coasts where the great maritime networks had once been the lifeline of civilization. The harbors that had bustled with merchant ships began to fall into disuse. It was as if the entire island was drawing inward, away from the sea that had made it prosper, retreating into a more defensive, more isolated existence. And in the Levantine world, in what we now call Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, the pattern repeated with a particular poignancy. Ugarit was gone, as we have already mourned. Sidon was devastated. Tyre was destroyed. Byblos, that ancient city of cedar merchants which had traded with Egypt for millennia, saw its great port fade. The inland centers too were not exempt. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, that carefully planned imperial city with its massive gates and its temples and its royal archives, it was abandoned. Not demolished with deliberate finality, but simply emptied of the structures of power that had sustained it. The archives themselves, those records that might have told us so much more about what was happening, were left behind in the ruins, their clay tablets eventually hardening in the fires that consumed the buildings. When archaeologists excavated the city centuries later, they found evidence of destruction, yes, but also evidence of something more elusive, the absence of recovery, the absence of a decision to rebuild. It was as if, once the machinery of palatial civilization was disrupted, no one had the resources, or the will, or the stability to restart it. What emerged in the wake of these collapses was something that historians and archaeologists have come to call the Dark Ages. This was not darkness as in evil or savagery, but darkness as in the literal loss of written records, the loss of the monumental architecture that announces itself across centuries, the loss of the dense networks of trade and communication that had once bound the Mediterranean world together. For roughly 200 years after the fall of the late Bronze Age centers, somewhere around the 12th century through the beginning of the 10th century before the Common Era, the Mediterranean world retreated into what we might describe as a kind of collective amnesia. The ability to read and write in the old scripts, the Linear B that Mycenaean scribes had used, the cuneiform that Hittites and their neighbors had employed, these systems of recording fell out of use. Population centers became smaller and more isolated. The great trading networks that had crisscrossed the sea were fragmented, interrupted, or simply ceased to function. Ships became fewer on the waters. Long-distance commerce, which had been the oxygen of the late Bronze Age world, seemed to nearly disappear. It is hard for us, living in an age of constant connection and rapid communication, to fully imagine what it meant for a world to lose its writing, to lose the ability to record and transmit complex information across space and time. Yet that is what happened. Entire histories, entire dynasties, entire ways of understanding the world were lost because the systems that had preserved and transmitted them collapsed. For 2 centuries, we have almost no written records from vast stretches of the Mediterranean. We do not hear the voices of scribes or kings or merchants. The archaeology tells us that people were still there, that communities continued to exist, that life went on in its persistent, daily way. But it was life without the apparatus of empire, life without the intricate administrative systems that had characterized the late Bronze Age world. And when, eventually, writing returned, when new alphabets emerged, when new systems of recording and communicating developed, the world that emerged was a fundamentally different world. The palace centers did not rise again. The old empires were not restored. What emerged from those 2 centuries of darkness was a world that we might recognize as closer to our own, a world of city-states and smaller political units, a world where power was more distributed, more local, though perhaps also more fragile. The Phoenicians would emerge as the great maritime traders of the early Iron Age, but they would be merchants and sailors rather than the administrators of vast bureaucratic empires. In the Aegean, the Greeks would slowly rebuild, but the Greeks of the early Iron Age would be nothing like the mighty Mycenaeans who had come before them. They would lose the memory of writing, lose the architectural grandeur of palace complexes, and instead develop a simpler, in some ways more democratic way of organizing their societies. What is perhaps most difficult for us to comprehend is the completeness of this rupture. This was not a quick catastrophe followed by swift rebuilding, but rather a genuine civilizational interruption that lasted for generations. Children were born and grew old without knowing the world their grandparents had known. The great palaces that had stood for centuries became ruins, then became mysterious piles of stones that succeeding generations could hardly understand. How could buildings so large have been built? Who had commanded such resources? The memory of the palatial age became mythologized, transformed into legend, the actual historical continuities obscured by the very distance and duration of the interruption. In those 2 centuries of darkness, something was lost that would never quite be recovered. Not just the empires and their bureaucratic apparatus, but a certain kind of Mediterranean coherence, a certain density of interaction and communication. When that world eventually reawakened, it would be a different world entirely. The word invasion itself might be the problem. When we look back across the centuries and see cities burning, ships arriving from nowhere, and great civilizations crumbling in what feels like a moment, our minds reach for the simplest story. Enemies came, conquered, destroyed. It is clean. It is understandable. It satisfies something in us, this narrative of external force meeting resistance. But standing in the ruins of Ugarit, or walking through the abandoned palace at Mycenae, many scholars have begun to wonder whether the word invasion actually distorts what happened, whether it imposes order on something far more tangled and terrible and gradual. Consider, for a long moment, a different angle entirely. What if the people we call the Sea Peoples were not raiders at all, but rather refugees? What if the same climatic catastrophe that was already strangling the inland civilizations, the droughts, the crop failures, the desperate scrambling for grain, had also made the sea routes unreliable and the islands they came from increasingly uninhabitable? In this reading, the movement of people from the eastern Mediterranean toward the wealthier, still functioning centers of Egypt and the Levantine coast becomes not an invasion in the military sense, but a migration born of desperation. Families, craftspeople, soldiers, yes, but soldiers hired because they needed work, and families following because they needed to survive. The ships became necessary because the land was failing. The violence that erupted was the friction of millions of desperate people pressing against the boundaries of still stable kingdoms. This theory gains some support from the archaeological record of environmental change, the evidence for a cooling period, a shift in ocean circulation, crop failures across multiple regions. These did not arrive all at once, but gradually, over decades and decades. Someone living in Cyprus in 1220 BCE might have noticed the harvests growing leaner year by year. Someone in the Aegean would have felt the pressure building as neighboring settlements competed for shrinking resources. The movement would have been organic, almost invisible at first. People trying to escape hunger, drifting toward the places where records say there was still food, still wealth, still functioning trade. The armed confrontation, then, becomes the inevitable collision when too many hungry people arrive at the gates of a kingdom that, despite everything, still wants to defend its borders. Yet there is another rival theory, quieter perhaps, but persistent among historians who study the collapse itself rather than the invaders. What if the people we blame for destroying the Bronze Age were not the cause at all, but a symptom? What if internal rebellion, social upheaval, and the fracturing of authority from within were already tearing the palatial systems apart, and the Sea Peoples, whoever they truly were, simply accelerated a process that was already underway? The evidence here is subtle but suggestive. Late Bronze Age kingdoms, we know, were characterized by rigid hierarchies, centralized control, and a merchant class that held enormous power. The wealth was concentrated in palaces and temples. The ordinary person, the farmer, the laborer, the conscript soldier, lived under that weight. What if the arrival of these outsiders, these mercenaries and desperate migrants, did not trigger the collapse, so much as offer an opportunity for people living under oppressive systems to shake them loose? What if there was collaboration? What if some people in these cities actually invited the disruption, hoping that in the chaos of invasion, old hierarchies might shatter? This is speculative, certainly, and scholars are cautious about assigning motive to the past, but it is worth holding lightly. The inscriptions we have are royal inscriptions. They are written by the people in power, the winners, the ones who survived to record their narrative. They would naturally frame the arrival of outsiders as invasion, as aggression. They would not record internal dissent or popular rebellion. The very fact that some of these cities fell so quickly, or that records suggest internal fires as well as external assault, hints at possibilities we cannot quite see. The third theory, and perhaps the most sobering in its implications, suggests that we are asking the wrong question entirely. What if there was no single invasion, no coordinated assault, no even identifiable enemy? What if, instead, the Bronze Age collapsed because all of its supporting systems failed simultaneously, each failure triggering others in a cascade that no single society, no single government, no single military response could arrest? This is systems collapse theory, and it draws our attention away from the dramatic narrative of battle and conquest and toward the grinding, invisible failures of interconnected structures. The Bronze Age world, as we have touched on before, was a web of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. Egypt depended on timber from the Levant and on the stability of Nubia for gold. The Hittites controlled roads and ore sources. Mycenaean Greece was woven into this trade network through Cypriot copper. Canaanite cities thrived because they sat at the intersection of these flows. Now imagine that the climate shifted. The rains failed, the harvests collapsed. Suddenly, Egypt has less food to trade for timber. The Hittites cannot guarantee the supply of ore or the safety of the roads. Cyprus becomes isolated as sea routes become dangerous. The web does not break at one point. It frays everywhere at once. Kingdoms begin to turn inward. Trade ceases. Without trade, economies collapse. Without functioning economies, armies cannot be paid or provisioned. Without armies, borders cannot be defended. Without functioning authority, cities begin to fracture from within. The Sea Peoples, in this reading, are not the cause of the collapse, but rather one of its many symptoms. Starving people on the fringes, displaced by drought or driven from islands by rising sea levels, or the failure of the fisheries that sustained them, moving toward regions where they hear there is still structure, still order, still food. They encountered not invulnerable empires, but kingdoms already hemorrhaging, already stretched beyond their capacity to respond. The violence that ensued was less invasion and more the collision of desperate systems trying simultaneously to survive. And perhaps this is the deepest insight, that the meaning of the word invasion shifts depending on which of these theories we hold. If the Sea Peoples were refugees, then invasion is a tragic necessity, the movement of the desperate towards survival. If they were agents of internal liberation, then invasion takes on the color of revelation, a moment when people under oppression saw a chance to break free. If they were merely one piece of a larger collapse, then invasion becomes almost a poetic word for something far more complex, not an assault from outside, but a system eating itself from within, and desperate people catching the fallout. What is certain, or nearly certain, is that no single explanation contains the whole truth. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not one thing, it was many things, happening in different places, at different times, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes independent. The Sea Peoples were real. We have their names in inscriptions, evidence of their settlements, artifacts of their presence. But whether they were primarily invaders or refugees, whether they destroyed civilizations, or merely poured through the cracks in civilizations already collapsing, whether they accelerated something inevitable or revealed something that was already dying, these are questions that shade into each other, and the answer likely contains pieces of all three possibilities, arranged differently depending on which city you look at, which moment in time you focus on, which document you trust. Out of that long darkness, slowly, like embers finding new fuel, civilizations began to kindle again. Not the same, never quite the same, but present, alive. The palaces were gone, the great administrative centers had crumbled into dust and memory, and yet from the rubble, from the scattered survivors huddled in smaller settlements, new peoples rose to claim the Mediterranean world as their own. The Phoenicians emerged first into the historical record with unmistakable clarity. They would become the greatest merchants and seafarers of the next age, sailing not just across familiar waters but beyond, to the edges of the known world. But consider for a moment who the Phoenicians really were. They were not invaders from distant lands. They were the survivors of the coastal Canaanite cities that had endured the chaos. Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, these were ancient ports, some of which had existed for centuries before the Bronze Age collapse. What changed was not who they were, but what they became. With the palatial powers gone, with the great empires that had once controlled trade shattered and silent, the Phoenicians stepped into a void. They inherited the maritime knowledge of their ancestors, the networks of exchange, the shipbuilding traditions, and in the absence of imperial oversight, they became independent, free to trade where they wished, to establish colonies, to spread their goods and their language across the Mediterranean and beyond. In a strange way, the catastrophe that had destroyed so much had also liberated them. The Israelites, meanwhile, emerged as a distinct people during this same period of transition. The archaeological evidence for early Israel is fragmentary and debated among scholars, but the presence of these new highland settlements in the central Levantine hills becomes increasingly visible around the 12th and 11th centuries. Were they there before? Perhaps. Did they arrive as part of the upheaval? Possibly. The historical record remains tantalizingly unclear, but what seems certain is that as the lowland cities crumbled and coastal authority collapsed, the inland hills became a place of refuge and reorganization. Here, in territories that the old imperial powers had never quite fully controlled, new communities took root. Iron tools began to appear, allowing for more effective terracing of hillsides, better agriculture in marginal lands. The very landscape itself began to transform, and yet, in the later biblical narratives, we find echoes of this transformation preserved, though distorted by centuries of retelling. The stories of conquest, of entry into a promised land, of battles against mysterious enemies, these may be distant, mythologized memories of a time of genuine upheaval and displacement. Greece, that cradle of classical civilization, seemed to vanish entirely for 200 years. The Mycenaean palaces burned. The Linear B script that had recorded the administrative affairs of kings fell silent and was forgotten. Writing itself disappeared from the Greek world, and yet, in the darkness, something endured. In the smaller settlements, in the villages scattered across the islands and mainland, Greek-speaking populations survived. They had no palaces, no organized kingdoms, no standing armies. They lived in what scholars once called a dark age, though that phrase itself reflects a bias, dark only to us, because the written record suddenly ceases. But to these people, it was simply their age, their lives. And when, eventually, the darkness lifted and writing returned to Greece, it would return transformed. The alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians, would become the vehicle for a new kind of literature, and Greece would never again be quite what it had been. The old palace culture would not resurrect itself. Something new would emerge instead. It is in the myths of these emerging peoples that we find the most intriguing traces of memory. The Greek legends speak of great invasions, of the Dorians sweeping down from the north, of Heracles and his army overwhelming the old world. The biblical narratives describe similarly violent incursions, strange peoples arriving by ship, conflicts with mysterious enemies. The Phoenician sources, maddeningly, are largely lost to us, but we might imagine that they too preserved their own accounts of upheaval. Were these myths historically accurate? Probably not, in any literal sense. But might they contain within them a distorted, mythologized version of what had truly occurred? The chaos of the collapse, the arrival of new peoples, the mixing of populations, the violence and displacement, all of this might have been transformed through centuries of retelling into the more stylized narratives we know. Consider the figure of the Philistines as they appear in the biblical texts. They are depicted as technologically advanced, strong, foreign. Settlements identified as Philistine, based on distinctive pottery styles and archaeology, do indeed appear in the coastal regions of Canaan around the time of the collapse. The pottery shows Aegean influences, suggesting connections to the Eastern Mediterranean world, and yet, within a few centuries, the Philistines had become thoroughly integrated into the local culture, speaking the local language, worshipping local gods, living within the existing social structures. They were not an occupying force that remained forever separate. They were absorbed, assimilated, transformed. Perhaps this too was what really happened to the Sea Peoples, whoever they truly were. Not a single unified invasion force, but rather various groups of displaced or adventurous populations, using the chaos as an opportunity to move, to raid, to settle, each eventually becoming part of the local fabric, their foreign origins gradually fading into legend. The Iron Age that emerged from this crucible was different in fundamental ways. The old systems of control, the palace, the scribal bureaucracy, the standing army, supplied by centralized authority, these belonged to a vanished world. In their place arose new forms of social organization, the polis in Greece, the tribal confederations in the highlands, the city-states of Phoenicia. Trade networks became more diffuse, less monopolized by imperial power. Writing, when it returned, served different purposes. It was used to record laws, to mark ownership, to communicate across distance. It was no longer the exclusive tool of palace administrators. And somewhere within all of this change, within the memories passed down through generations, the figure of the Sea Peoples persisted, not clearly, not in any way that would satisfy the inquiring historian, but present nonetheless, in the myths of invasion, in the stories of arrival from over the sea, in the tales of conflict and displacement that formed the origin narratives of new peoples. The Sea Peoples did not vanish because their story was not over. It was simply entering a new chapter, one where they would be remembered only in fragments, in distorted echoes, in the cultural DNA of civilizations yet to come. What remains when a civilization asks itself who it was, and finds no certain answer echoing back? The Sea Peoples, whoever they truly were, have left us this strange inheritance, a name without a face, a force without a unified origin, a question that has occupied scholars and dreamers for nearly 3,000 years. And perhaps it is fitting, in a way, that they remain obscure. Their very anonymity speaks to something deeper about the fragility of all human order. We have traced them through smoke and stone, through desperate letters and triumphal reliefs, through pottery shards and genetic codes that hint at migrations we can never fully prove. We have watched empires crumble and watched new peoples emerge from the rubble with different gods, different stories, different ways of building walls and trading grain. The Bronze Age knew its collapse with certainty, and yet the details slipped away into legend almost as soon as they happened. The Philistines remembered in later Greek and Hebrew traditions grew more monstrous and more foreign with each retelling, as if the human mind needed monsters to explain catastrophe. It was easier to imagine an invasion of the damned than to sit with the possibility that the world simply broke under the weight of its own complexity. And what do we actually know when we strip away the theories and the reconstructions? We know that people moved. We know that trade routes fractured and reformed. We know that cities burned and were abandoned. We know that somewhere in the transition between bronze and iron, between palace and field, between divine kingship and the first struggles of democratic impulse, the old order died and something new was born. The exact choreography of that death remains a mystery, written in fragments, in silences between the words, in the spaces where evidence simply doesn't exist. Perhaps this is a reminder about memory itself. We are haunted by the idea that history should be knowable, that with enough expertise and technology, we might illuminate every corner of the past. But the Bronze Age collapse teaches us something humbler. It teaches us that the mightiest empires leave surprisingly shallow traces. It teaches us that catastrophe erases as much as it records. A fleet of ships leaving harbor in panic leaves no more archaeological fingerprint than a fleet departing in trade. A drought that slowly empties a city causes no visible scar in stone. People die by the thousands and are forgotten within a generation, their names already lost to survivors, preoccupied with the next meal, the next season, the next decade of survival. The sea peoples were real. They moved through the Mediterranean, engaged in piracy and trade and perhaps invasion. They settled in lands that would remember them in new forms, in new gods, in new stories. They were also chimeras, products of fear and misunderstanding and the way that distant powers experience threatening strangers as undifferentiated force, rather than as men with families and fears and reasons. They were raiders and refugees, opportunists and victims, destroyers and settlers. They were all of these things, and we will never fully know which descriptions apply to which people, in which moments, with what intentions. The historical record simply doesn't preserve that kind of clarity. It preserves impressions, traces, hints. And isn't there something peaceful in accepting that? In recognizing that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, that some questions can be contemplated without demanding resolution, that the deepest truths about human history may be those that resist being pinned down and categorized and filed away in neat explanations. The civilizations that rose after the Bronze Age collapse had their own flourishing, their own traumas, their own forgotten mysteries. They didn't need to know the exact identity of the sea peoples any more than we do. What mattered to them was that they survived. What mattered was that they built something new on the foundations of something old. Think of all the countless people who lived through that period of upheaval. Think of a merchant in Ugarit reading the pleas for ships and grain, knowing that no relief would come. Think of a Hittite scribe in the capital, watching the city empty as administrators and soldiers and common folk understood that the palace would not be defended. Think of a warrior on the shores of Egypt, seeing unfamiliar ships on the horizon and wondering if this would be the day. Think of the children born in the years after, growing up in a world that had forgotten what the great palatial centers looked like, inheriting stories so garbled and distorted that they seemed like myths. These lives, these moments of individual terror and individual relief and individual adaptation are what history really is. Not grand theories or triumphant narratives or the certainty of kings and priests that their order would endure, but the messy, fragile, resilient truth that people go on. They adapt, they remember incorrectly, they create new meaning from the ruins of old meaning, they survive. The Mediterranean that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was not the Mediterranean that came before. The trade networks reformed along different lines. The great empires fractured into smaller, more regional powers. Writing changed. Religious practice changed. The very language people used to describe the divine and the human and the natural world transformed. And somewhere in that transformation, the memory of the sea peoples became something else. Became story, became myth, became the phantom invader haunting the margins of historical consciousness. We are always trying to see clearly into the past. We are always hoping that better tools, more evidence, newer theories will reveal the truth. And sometimes this hope is rewarded. But sometimes what we learn is that clarity itself may be an illusion, that some historical moments are genuinely opaque, that we are looking at echoes of echoes and calling them facts. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is the nature of deep time, the nature of human memory, the nature of chaos itself. The sea peoples, then, are a mirror. They reflect back to us our own need to understand, to categorize. to create coherent narratives from fragmented evidence. They are real and they are mysterious, and that combination is not a contradiction. It is the human condition stretched across millennia. Every empire believes itself permanent. Every civilization is certain of its continuation, and yet the archaeological record shows us city after city, empire after empire, way of life after way of life, all gone, all reduced eventually to pottery and stone foundations, and the questions that archaeologists and scholars ask in the quiet work of reconstruction. There is a strange comfort in that, not comfort in destruction or loss, but in the simple reality that all things pass, that human order is built on foundations more temporary than we can quite believe while we are living within it, that the systems we trust, the structures we rely upon, the certainties we hold so firmly, they too will someday be dust and mystery and a puzzle for people we cannot imagine asking questions we cannot foresee. And those future people, looking back at our own time, with their own better technologies and their own different assumptions, will probably find us just as opaque, just as contradictory, just as impossible to fully understand as we find the sea peoples. History doesn't end in clarity. It ends in acceptance. It ends in the recognition that we are all temporary. We are all part of something larger than ourselves that we can only partially understand. We are all leaving traces that will be misinterpreted by others, or perhaps not discovered at all. This is not a sad thing. It is, in its own way, liberating. It frees us from the burden of believing that the truth must be knowable, that if we just work hard enough we can solve every mystery. Some mysteries are meant to remain. Some stories are more powerful for their incompleteness, for the way they invite us into the uncertainty, rather than resolving it into false certainty. So the sea peoples remain, floating in the Mediterranean of history and memory, neither fully known nor fully forgotten, neither certainly invaders nor certainly refugees, neither the sole cause of collapse nor mere witnesses to it. They remain as a testament to the limits of what we can know, to the humbling reality that the past is always partially closed to us, to the beauty that emerges when we stop demanding that everything be explained and simply allow ourselves to sit with the mystery. The cities burned, the people moved, the empires changed shape, and somewhere in that transformation, new civilizations were born, and people, as they always do, went on living. They told their stories and forgot their sources. They built upon the ruins of the old. They created meaning from chaos. And slowly, over centuries, the memory of the sea peoples faded into legend, into myth, into the dim awareness that something terrible and transformative had once happened, even if the exact nature of that happening had been lost to time. This is how history lives, not in certainty, not in the confident proclamations of rulers or the careful records of scribes, but in the slow accretion of half-remembered stories, in the pottery found in soil, in the questions we ask of fragments, in the imaginative compassion we extend toward people we will never know. And as you drift further now, deeper into the quiet hours of the night, perhaps you can carry with you this gentler way of thinking about the past, not as something that must be solved, but as something that invites us into contemplation, not as a problem demanding resolution, but as a mystery that, in its mystery, speaks to something true about all of us. We are all unknowable in some sense. We are all part of systems larger than ourselves. We are all temporary, and our certainties are all eventually destined to become the mysteries that puzzle those who come after. The sea peoples are gone. They became other things, other peoples, other stories, and in their vanishing, they left us this gift, not an answer, but a question, and the question, held lightly as you rest, as you let your mind wander towards sleep, is perhaps more valuable than any answer could ever be. The question is what keeps us human. The question is what connects us across the millennia to all those other people who wondered, who worried, who tried to make sense of their world even as it transformed around them. Rest now with that question. Let it drift with you into stillness.